I'm Teresa Coraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, my topic is the Great Reset and Ukraine, the same masters or different? Ukraine is a topic that has been languishing last on my playlist, which it doesn't deserve. Both Aaron Mate and Glenn Greenwald have come out with excellent articles this week. And as Glenn points out, we could once admit that the $105 billion that we're sending to Ukraine is going to what had been called openly in the media neo-Nazi battalions, who are the core of Ukraine's defense, and also to a corrupt oligarch who is hiding money in all kinds of tax havens around the world. So we're going to be looking at that. The question that I'm posing, I put as a comment on Aaron's thread, and I worded it this way. What I continue to struggle with is whether the Ukraine conflict and Great Reset are at odds or coordinated, and who would those coordinators be? The U.S. strategy of weakening Russia could be used against the U.S. if the purpose of a third player was to run the U.S. out of money, ammunition, and weapons, using Russia as a proxy. The vaccine mandates have also resulted in fewer U.S. military personnel from expulsion for denial or from death and disability. In the same way that Churchill enabled World War II so that Germany and Russia would bleed each other dry, as he admitted, is there another power that wants NATO and Russia to do the same? And who? The City of London? Davos? China? The deep state? Or do all of these roads ultimately lead to Rothschilds? So we'll be looking at that question using Glenn and Aaron's research. And then I also am going to look at someone, Jeff Childers of Coffee and COVID, who has asked a similar question in his year-end retrospective. And I'll be ending this episode by looking at Matt Arrett, who has been doing some interesting research, as always, looking at both sides of that question with geopolitics and Ukraine, and also with COVID, and some really interesting interviews of Jessica Rose. Let's do this. Aaron's article is called Their Blood, Our Bullets, the Cold Hard U.S. Calculus in Ukraine. It starts, to close out the year of its proxy war against Russia, Washington greeted a visiting Ukrainian President Zelensky with lavish praise and pledges of more weaponry. A chorus of voices hailed Zelensky as the second coming of Winston Churchill. The lame duck Congress approved an additional $45 billion in Ukraine-related spending, most of it on weapons, bringing the official U.S. price tag for the proxy war to more than $105 billion. And he shows a montage of different newscasters who are all comparing Zelensky to Churchill. A reader named Liam McCollum tweeted that the comparison was apt because Churchill conspired to enmesh the U.S. in World War II. But Zelensky, I point out, is an actor in someone else's play. He's a face card. He's not a player. And so Churchill's plot as a player didn't just force U.S. involvement, but he stated that his geopolitical aims were to weaken two competitors, Germany and Russia, by prolonging the war at their expense. Aaron shows how the pretense of winning for Ukraine has been dropped for an interminable stalemate between the NATO, EU, and Russia. Aaron writes, in Europe, The Economist estimates that around 147,000 more people, 4.8% above average, would die in typical winter temperatures this year if electricity prices remain at current levels. The U.S. response to these woes was recently captured by veteran Washington Post columnist David Ignatius. As Europe faces a winter of heating and electricity shortages, rising prices, and sagging economic growth, Ignatius wrote, the message from Washington will be, stay the course. Oliver North, the former Reagan administration official convicted for lying to Congress about the Iran-Contra scandal, recently explained why he believes so passionately in staying the course. The Ukraine proxy war, North told Fox News, is very much like what Ronald Reagan did back in the 80s, invoking Reagan-backed freedom fighters, the death squads in Central America and the Mujahideen, later Al-Qaeda, of Afghanistan. North added, those people were willing, as the Ukrainian people are, to use their blood and our bullets. Plus, North added, the Ukraine war will send the right message to China over its dispute with Taiwan, where the U.S. should be sending the same kinds of weapon systems that we're now providing to the Ukrainians. Now let's look at Glenn Greenwald. Glenn has been putting out something called System Update, Monday through Friday at 7 Eastern Standard Time, and that is on Rumble and is so much fun. He does a monologue and then he's been doing different interviews and he gets much more sassy. I think that he gives himself permission to get a little more snarky when he has someone else to play off of. So I really recommend it. And those are all also being posted after the interview, and subscribers have access to a written transcript. So in Glenn Greenwald's episode was called Media Rewrites Ukraine's Dark History. He compares what the mainstream media has written about the Azov battalion and corruption in Ukraine before and after the Russian reaction. And he talks about their former coverage of Zelensky himself. He writes, this Guardian article in 2021, just 6 or 5 months before Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's become prohibited to say anything negative about Zelensky in the West, as the Guardian noted, revealed anti-oligarch Ukrainian president offshore connections. They put anti-oligarch in quotes because they were mocking the fact that Zelensky was posing as someone opposed to oligarchy and corruption when he himself, as revealed by the Pandora Papers, had all sorts of offshore accounts. The article reads in The Guardian, on the campaign trail, Zelensky pledged to clean up Ukraine's oligarch-dominated ruling system, and he railed against politicians such as the wealthy incumbent who hid their assets offshore. The leaked documents suggest he had or has a previously undisclosed stake in an offshore company which he appears to have secretly transferred to a friend weeks before winning the presidential vote. Before becoming president, Zelensky declared some of his private assets. They included cars, property, and 3 of the co-owned offshore companies. One, Film Heritage, which he held jointly with his wife, is registered in Belize. But the Pandora Papers show further offshore assets that Zelensky appears not to have revealed. Film Heritage had a 25% stake in Davegra, a Cyprus holding company. Davegra, in turn, owns Maltex Multi-Capital Corp., a company previously unknown, registered in the tax haven of the British Virgin Islands. Since entering politics, Zelensky has been dogged by claims that he is under the influence of Igor Kolomoisky, someone I write about in another episode, a billionaire whose TV channel screened Zelensky's show. During the campaign, Zelensky's opponents alleged $41 million from Kolomoisky entities found its way between 2012 and 2016 into offshore firms belonging to Zelensky and his circle, including Film Heritage. And Glenn writes, are you comfortable yet with $100 billion and counting that the United States is sending to Ukraine under the care of these people? He continues, here is a chart prepared by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists about those papers, and you can see here the countries most mentioned in the Pandora Papers. documents that prove how extremely wealthy people in politics hide their wealth because they don't want it to be detected. And there you see Ukraine has the lead by far as the most mentioned, as the country with the most politicians named in these papers, with 38. And Russia, who we never stop hearing about in terms of their corruption and oligarchs, has exactly half, 19. And then there are the rest of the countries. And then, after giving many more scathing examples on Ukraine, Glenn interviews David Zweig, who is the one who's looked at the Twitter dump on COVID censorship, on misinformation. So initially, Glenn seems to be playing devil's advocate in looking at how that might be justified. He says, when you're talking about a pandemic that's killing millions of people worldwide, in this case, you could validly say that misinformation actually kills in the literal sense, not in the sense of, say, hate speech's violence. But if you have people falsely encouraging others to not take the vaccine because this and that will happen, you could end up causing people to die who otherwise wouldn't. And therefore, the government would say, our job number one is to protect the health and well-being and safety of the population. So why shouldn't we take steps to strongly encourage or even cajole big tech to prevent what could be fatal misinformation from circulating all over the world? And then David replies, yeah, obviously it's such a huge and complex question to answer. I think succinctly what my reporting shows is that although that may have been the intention, and particularly when you're dealing with something as complex as a topic as science, that to have bots, through these algorithms, and to have independent contractors or even, employees at Twitter itself trying to educate something like the granular details of myocarditis or that the effectiveness of masks in various trial data. There was just an absolute zero chance that they were going to get this right all the time. So I'm sympathetic to the challenge if you are in a government and you don't want all sorts of wild, crazy stuff going online that are going to confuse people or it can be dangerous. I think the argument could be made, and many people have made this argument, that blocking a lot of information, particularly information which I showed in my reporting that was from published studies in peer-reviewed data, that when you're blocking that, that's also dangerous. So the risk doesn't only run in one direction. Glenn then points out that usually the argument for censorship is that these are ordinary citizens who have no idea what they're talking about and that they are spouting dangerous opinions. But in this case, he says, it was people who were much more highly credentialed than the Twitter censors. And David, to his credit, added, for all our talk about credentials experts who should be able to voice their opinions, there are regular citizens who may not have had any credentials, but I saw them run circles around, physicians and epidemiologists, and there are plenty of incredibly smart people. And to me, I don't care who the person is, I care what information they are presenting. So while Glenn is clear about Ukraine being a ruthless and cynically cold-blooded power grab, in the case of COVID, he's still saying, well, intentions were good, and this is a complicated thing, and misinformation, in this case, can really kill, and therefore it's justified and risky to allow, as David says, all sorts of wild, crazy stuff going on online that's going to confuse people or it can be dangerous. So while David sees bots and algorithms as a crude method, he believes the goal is understandable. that there is no deep, dark conspiracy of, say, depopulation. For those of us in the dissident community, I don't think there is any question anymore of intent and the agenda of depopulation. But for us, it's only a question of who. And this is something that Jeff Childers addresses in Coffee and COVID in his retrospective of 2022. He points to the Sherlock Holmes story of the dog that didn't bark, that it's not just looking at the evidence of what's there, but it's also looking at what's missing. He writes, "What was missing was any political debate about how to respond to the virus. When the first lockdowns rolled in, where were all the legislators, the parliaments, the ministers, and the delegates? How could such a monumental, universal, economy-wrecking, border-mangling decision be lawfully made world over without one single government voting on anything? This was done in every country," he writes, "through the mechanism of executive order. Conveniently, every single nation out of 175 countries apparently had laws allowing unilateral executive action, instantaneously bypassing every democratic safeguard. And bizarrely, every executive agreed with the same plan, apparently, or someone bypassed or overruled them all. It proved that our legislators, parliamentarians, delegates, and ministers are merely window dressing when push comes to shove. They're just actors, whether they know it or not. Someone made a call." Jeff doesn't identify who that someone is, although he names a lot of the usual suspects and then says those are hierarchies and this was too coordinated. It had to come from a single person. And he says it doesn't matter who that person is. The question is, how do we reverse this? When he looks at it, he points back to Reagan as an example of how quickly things can change and talks about Reagan's the House Un-American Committee and how that was able to rout out communism. And he sees the potential for change because now Republicans are in the House. And as he says, fur will fly. So now, where I see Glenn having a blind spot of not being conspiracy enough minded, I think Jeff's blind spot is having too much faith in bipartisan politics. That's something that Glenn does not have. His guest on that same episode was Jimmy Dore. And as Jimmy says, "My job is to remind people that it's not left or right. It's us against them now." And that obviously, Glenn, not to be hyperbolic, but that is the message that scares them, is that when the people on the left and the right understand that they have a common enemy and that we have actually more in common than the oligarchy wants us to realize, that's what actually threatens them, which is why they have these cultural battles on such high octane right now. In previous episodes that I'll link to on Substack and that are also in a playlist on YouTube, I have been talking about all of the people who are benefiting from and have been pushing this conflict in Ukraine, from the neocons and Victoria Nuland and Robert Kagan, her husband, and the push for U.S. hegemony. There's the moneyed interest like Kolomoisky. Michael Hudson has talked about all of the pressure to get revenge against Germany for accepting Russian oil and not putting a ban on that. And so there are a lot of very corrupt figures that are involved in this. But none of them really have a logical tie-in to the Great Reset. So when I look at whether there is any entity where there is overlap, the only one that comes to mind is China. As Oliver North has said, the next one that we're going to go after is Taiwan. And so the more that, if you look at it from Winston Churchill's, the more that NATO, US, and Russia can bleed each other dry over Ukraine, the less ammunition is going to be left for anything against China. I don't know whether that's a hegemonic kind of agenda or just a simple defensive one. So there is a logic to that, and there is some logic to China's involvement with the Great Reset. And that's not just looking at the virus coming from Wuhan, but looking at the fact that they have been way ahead on the depopulation with their two-child policy, and that they also have had the most severe lockdowns on the planet. So someone within China has been very much pushing that agenda for many, many years, and that Wuhan is something that the US has been involved in, of course, and that Ukraine is another place that our bioweapons have been positioned. So I think that, like Jeff Childers says, it's not really just an organization, because that's too complex. It requires too much agreement. I think this does all come back to the same entities, and I still think the Rothschilds need to be considered as the core of all of the money systems and all of the power and all of the decisions that keep getting made, that all roads do lead back to Rothschilds. When they talk about U.S. interest, we know that that doesn't include you or me. And in the same way, China is not one person's agenda or one particular faction's agenda. And so Matt Ehret has been talking a lot about some excellent research on what China's doing with the Belt and Road Initiative and all the different transportation corridors, and how they are developing different places that have been under the thumb of U.S. hegemony for a very long time. Matt has published extensive research on Sergei Glazyev, Putin's economic advisor, and his economic plan for a multipolar world. This is also something that's been in process for a long time, but this and all of the Ukrainian sanctions backfiring are giving that opportunity for that to be brought into existence. And so I think that there's really not someone in charge so much as there are people who are playing their roles. And their roles, whether it is hero or villain, and lately I'm not even sure there's a difference between those are roles that are bringing about a different world. And I think 2023 is going to be a time when we're able to see this come to fruition. And someone who I want to end by talking about is Jessica Rose and her interviews with Matt. I am learning so much about biology. I never knew that cells had their own gut microbiomes. So what Jessica does is she explains things in a way that any layperson can understand, and she's funny, very down to earth, and able to make the science something that we can understand. I think this is coming to a time when we are thinking for ourselves, and those who are not thinking for themselves are not faring very well these days. So while that paradigm crashes and burns, what's going to be left are a lot of people who are saying, yes, we're capable. We know how to read, we know how to research, and we know how to understand the truth. To follow this up and to pull these two threads together, I'm going to suggest the Reset's 3 agendas and then the playlist on Ukraine and geopolitics. Thank you, and please check out Substack, where these will all have links.